My portfolio for this module consists of a live broadcast interview, a television news package and a 15-minute podcast. Within these three pieces, I have tried to showcase my ability as a journalist to be versatile by covering stories on both a local and national level. I did this by producing work that covered the university staff strikes, which are a national issue, and also by covering a charity that is based locally in Leeds. I found the module challenging on the whole due to not having any previous experience in broadcast media, and at first I felt very uncomfortable being in front of the camera or speaking as part of a radio package or podcast. This meant that the opportunities to practice both in front of the camera and creating audio recordings in the various workshop tasks each week were invaluable as they forced me to get out of my comfort zone. By the end of the module, I had developed my confidence enough to feel comfortable and filmed a piece of camera at the side of a busy road, which felt like a strong victory for me. The first element of the portfolio we were required to produce was a TV news package. For this, I chose to create a package about an organisation called Litter Free Leeds after seeing coverage of their Leeds Goes Purple event on social media. When deciding to do this, I wanted the main focus of the package to be the people involved. As a result of this, I knew that I wanted to interview volunteers and those who helped to run the organisation, as they are the people who are the heartbeat of the charity and the work that they do. I also ensured that the majority of the B-roll footage I used showed the volunteers and what they were doing. After reaching out to Litter Free Leeds, I then went along with them on one of their litter picking excursions on Gelderd Road and interviewed a volunteer called Graham and one of their coordinators called Sandra McLean. By using a tripod and adhering to the rule of first taught to us on the module, I was able to frame the shot so that the interviews with Sandra and Graham were conducted with the other group members litter picking in the background. This helped to show the groups in action and illustrate the points the interviewees were making. I also interviewed a counsellor called Kevin Ritchie in order to get an outside point of view on the work the organisation does. Counsellor Ritchie has done lots of work with Litter Free Leeds since they were founded in 2017, which meant that he was able to speak knowledgeably about the charity. The workshop task and the modular content emphasised the need to use a range of wide, medium and close-up shots in order to keep the package visually interesting. While on location, I made sure to film as much B-roll footage as possible from different angles and distances, meaning that in the editing process, I was able to make my cutaways flow between the two different types of shots. This, I believe, made my TV package look very professional and also more interesting for viewers to watch. I also made sure that I matched up the words that the interviews were saying with the B-roll footage. For example, when I was talking to Sandra McLean about litter bins, I included a cutaway of a litter bin.
Leeds has a plentiful supply of litter bins, and the message really is, if you don't find a litter bin, take it home.
This helped to illustrate the point Sandra was making, as well as give my package a more professional look. If I was to do the package again, one thing I would improve is my introductory piece to camera. A mistake I made was not writing a script and learning it beforehand. This meant that on the day, it was taking me lots of takes to try and get a good enough introduction, and unfortunately it did start to rain and I had to stop filming before I filmed a take good enough to use. Because I did want to include a piece to camera, I returned to the same location to film the introduction again. However, unlike my initial attempts, the volunteers were not in the background, which would have been better at showing where I was and why I was there. Next time, I would write and learn a script beforehand to make it a smoother process. A resource I did find extremely useful when editing my video is a YouTube channel called Vince Opera, and more specifically a video titled Premiere Pro Tutorial for Beginners 2023, Everything You Need to Know. Within the 20-minute video, the host was able to explain and show the process of importing raw video footage and putting these together to create a sequence of shots. I also supplemented this video with a number of others that taught me how to adjust the volume of the audio and add name captions. One of the most useful tips in the video by Vince Opera was to create separate bins for each type of footage I had, such as introductions, B-roll, interviews, etc. By doing this, it allowed me to keep my footage organised and quickly find what I needed among the many hours of footage I had. The second element of my portfolio is a 15-minute podcast. For this component, I wanted to produce a podcast on a topic that I was genuinely passionate about to ensure what I created would sound authentic and would therefore be more interesting to listen to. Because of this, I chose to create a podcast about Leeds Rhinos, as I am a season ticket holder at the club and I have been a lifelong fan. Based on my knowledge and research, I knew that unlike many other sports, there are very few podcasts about rugby league and only one about the Leeds Rhinos. Therefore, this gave me the opportunity to give fans of their club a voice and provide a platform that is lacking in the market currently. A source that really influenced my choice of podcast topic and style is a podcast I listen to on a weekly basis called Bloke in a Bar. This is an Australian podcast that covers rugby league in Australia, and I really enjoy the roundtable style of discussions members of the podcast have on different topics in the sport, and the style of podcast is something I try to replicate for my own. The specific topic I chose for my podcast was the reign of Rowan Smith as head coach of the Leeds Rhinos men's team. As the 21st of April marked 1 year since he was appointed as head coach, through contacting fans on Twitter and Facebook, I was able to find two fans, Mark and Laurie, to interview who had varying views on Rowan Smith. This proved to be a good formula as the fact that they had varying views helped to provide balance and also make the discussion between me and the guests more lively. An issue I faced when producing my podcast was that due to people dropping out at short notice, I had to record separate interviews with my two guests. This meant when editing I had to ensure that there were both seamless links between the two voices to make the conversation sound like a discussion, which was a type of podcast I intended to produce. When interviewing Mark and Laurie separately, I tried to ask the same or similar questions to make the process of editing their two interviews together easier. Furthermore, another issue for me was that the audio was recorded over Zoom. This meant that the quality is not as good as it would have been if I recorded the interviews in a podcast studio. However, this was something I had to compromise on as my guests were only available in the evenings. As I had no prior experience with radio or podcasting, I found both the radio workshops with Katie Hall and the podcast workshops at the end of the semester extremely valuable, and they helped me to produce a more exciting podcast. In the workshops during the module, we learned about the importance of using sounds other than voices to make the recording more interesting. This is why I chose to use small clips of commentary from the games that we spoke about during the podcast to better illustrate what we were discussing and allow the listener to imagine the games based on the commentary clips. Given the fact that the podcast could only be 15 minutes and I had over an hour's worth of audio, I initially felt quite overwhelmed by the task of narrowing it down to within the time limit. However, a Panopta recording Katie Hall's radio workshop content showed how to use labels and extra tracks on Audacity, which really helped me to cut the long audio into more manageable sections for me to edit. As a result, I was able to include all the content I wanted to include within my podcast while keeping it below the required 15 minutes. The final element of my portfolio was a live news broadcast. For this, I chose to cover the university staff strikes which have been happening throughout this academic year. The strikes were both convenient to cover as they took place close to the university, and also I had experienced the impact of the strikes both myself and as well as talked to other students about the strikes, which helped when developing my questions. Through Facebook, I was able to contact a member of the Leeds Student Solidarity Group who I interviewed at the site of the strikes at the Parkinson building. One aspect of this piece that I was happy with was the questions that I asked George. Hugh Edwards, in the series by the BBC for young reporters, talks about how it is key for a journalist to be well informed in order to ask the right questions and challenge the interviewee if necessary. For my live news package, I made sure to do prior research on the topic to make sure the questions I asked were informed by the latest developments on the ongoing dispute. Before the interview, I did not know that George also worked for the university, which meant I had to quickly change my pre-planned questions to ask him more about this and his thoughts on the New Deal as a university worker rather than a student. My prior research allowed me to react well to the new information presented mid-interview. The fact that George was both a student and a teaching assistant was beneficial as it meant that I was able to get the perspective of both a student and university employee within the same live interview. There are a number of challenges I ran into while filming my live news broadcast that impacted on the result of the final piece. Firstly, the tripod I was intending to use was broken and I didn't check it until I arrived on location. This meant that the person operating the camera for me had to hold it throughout filming, and because of this, the footage is shaky at times, making it look less professional. This experience taught me a valuable lesson about checking equipment prior to using it to make sure that I do not run into the same problem. A second issue was that when I turned up to meet George to interview him, the picket line had already finished. Central to a live news broadcast, including the examples we were shown in class, is being in the thick of the action, and unfortunately in my case, this was missing as everyone had left when I interviewed George. If I was going to redo the piece, I would make sure to film in a location and at a time where the interviewee can be placed within the action. According to Harkup-O'Neill in their article What is News, a news story usually meets one or more of 10 key requirements. Number 8 on their list of requirements is relevance. Therefore, in my own journey of creating this portfolio, I've ensured that the content I've produced is relevant to the time that it is being created. For example, my live news piece is focused on the university staff strike, which has been happening throughout this academic year, while my news package focusing on Litter Free Leeds was made immediately following their Leeds Goes Purple event, which is their biggest event of the year. During the taught element of the module, it has been emphasised to us that people are the key to any story. Therefore, throughout my portfolio, I've made sure to put people at the centre of my work. Within my news package, the B-roll footage I use during interviews and during my ULA mostly contained footage of volunteers doing the work they do. Furthermore, in my podcast, I try to devote most of the time to my two guests to speak. Although I am also a fan and have my own views on Roland Smith, I wanted to act as a conduit for the views of my guests, Laurie and Mark. Throughout the process of completing this module, by following Article 5 of the Ofcom Broadcast Regulation and the taught content of the module, I've been able to accurately and impartially report on a number of issues and causes based in and happening in Leeds. By covering local and national issues, I've been able to put together a well-rounded portfolio that showcases my ability as a journalist to report on a range of topics, as well as the development of my skills as an audio and visual broadcaster.